Thank you, Danielle, for joining me on the show today. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while and appreciate you taking the time. You are the co-founder and general partner at 1517 Fund, and before that, you're known for working at the Thiel Fellowship for a while, helping them do some of the amazing things that they did over the years. So looking forward to digging into what the magic was behind finding all these great founders and individuals. But first and foremost, welcome to the show, and would love to get started by hearing you tell your own story, as usual, from as early as you're willing to start to where you are today and how you made some of the decisions you made along the way.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Jake. I really appreciate you taking the time. The point that I think will be good to start with, and we'll go into some storytelling here, is actually just sort of my own educational journey. I was, I was 18 in 1998, and I was going to college, and I didn't really know why. And I remember even questioning it a little bit. I got into the school that I wanted to go to, which is actually an all-women school called Simmons College in Boston. And when I got the acceptance, it made me think a little bit of like, wait, why am I even doing this at all? And I remember saying that out loud to my mother, like, does this even make sense? And she was pretty right on it. I was one of the first persons in my family to go to college, and everyone in my family had me slated to probably go on to much more higher education than that. So she basically said, over my dead body, are you not going to go to undergrad? And also at the time, I didn't have a lot of ideas of what else I would do. When I was starting college, laptops were becoming more accessible to the general public. But you still couldn't necessarily build a startup on it or something like that. So I don't think I was having any machinations of that there was a particular other thing that I would do, but just this light question in my head of like, I wonder if there's something else or something different. But that's kind of as far as that question went at the time. And I ended up finishing school with a degree in psychology as well as performance music. And I was on my way to grad school. I had applied to a bunch of different places, and I was going to go to school potentially for neuropsychology, which is part of what I studied in undergrad. And I had an internship for a couple of years at the Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston, which is a very prestigious place to be. I think, I don't even know what's going on to date, but at the time I was the youngest intern they had ever had. And I kind of just made this opportunity happen for myself where I walked in the door and said, hey, I think what you all are doing here is really interesting. Is there an opportunity for me to shadow people who work here? And it was the first time anyone had done that. And they brought me on board. So I thought that's where my career was going to go. And I had applied to grad school. And I remember when I got into grad school, I had the same question of like, am I going to spend all this time in school? When instead I could potentially be out in the working world. And it was a big decision because when I thought about it, most of the people I knew who had gone on to grad school weren't finishing until they were in their late 20s or early 30s. And so it was like this really big question of like, am I really going to triple down on this particular commitment? And one of the things that came to me was kind of like this early quarter life crisis where I said, gosh, the thing I've always wanted to do is actually to teach. But everyone growing up told me those who can't teach, the pay is terrible. There's no respect. Like basically everyone was sort of veering me off on this other path. And when I would tell people I was going towards something like neuropsych, they'd be really excited. Even my friend groups, it sort of meant something. It was like, oh, you must be smart if you're studying this particular area. And I actually struggled in school quite a bit, in elementary and middle school. And so getting that kind of kudos from people was very gratifying. And I think it made me not listen to myself at a certain point and listen to what other people thought was interesting or cool. And I noticed that I was kind of going to grad school because other people thought that I should go, not because I had this burning desire. And that's kind of what happened to me is I woke up one morning and figured out, wow, I do not have this burning desire to go to grad school. So why would I do this? And I looked back through my past and thought, gosh, I've always really loved teaching. but I don't want to be like a traditional teacher. Um, I don't want to be in like a typical classroom and, go through half two subjects and whatnot. But what I thought about was, what I could do is be a private tutor, because in that realm, I can be working with students all the time in different things. Every day is kind of different. I don't have to think about classroom management. So I started a tutoring company instead of going to grad school, and started working on it. And I fell into this interesting sphere of people who were homeschoolers and unschoolers. Back when I was starting this company, it was before Craigslist was totally creepy, and I had ads on Craigslist for tutoring. And I had a couple homeschool families reach out to me, which was really great because the majority of my families had been public and private school kids, which also meant that most of my work all started after like 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And, I wanted things to do earlier in the day as well. And also, one thing about public and private school students was that I kind of felt like I was putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, because I was basically going over to people's house to do homework help and try to catch people up. But, when someone is 3 grades behind on something and you're trying to catch them up while maintaining the work they're doing, it's very difficult. And then I remember the first time I went over a homeschooler's house, it was a totally different experience. The children were so excited for me to get there. They would ask if I could stay for multiple hours. Can I do math and science and reading? Like, they were just sort of like oozing with enthusiasm. And the students I was working with who were in public and private school, they enjoyed that I came over to help them, but they didn't like what we had to do because we kind of had to do all the have to stuff of school. And they appreciated that I would try to do it in a way that would work for them and make it more fun. But it was just very different when you go over someone's house who is abundantly overjoyed to see you and is enthusiastic about learning. And I found that this extended to many homeschooling families that I worked with. And I ended up working with a homeschool co-op that was a group of secular homeschoolers in San Diego. And I loved working with that group. And that group actually really influenced my own way of thinking about what it means to be an educated person and a learner. And the woman who started that group came to me one day and said, "Hey, I've been thinking about starting a charter school. Would you do it with me?" And, we didn't have startup vernacular at the time. But what she was basically saying is, "Hey, I want to scale what we're doing in this co-op. Would you do it with me?" And at first I thought she was crazy. I was like, "You're nuts. Like, we hate school. Why would we want to start one?" But one thing was true, is that we kept seeing parents come to our group and say, "Hey, I don't have time to do this, but I would love to work with a homeschool co-op or something like that." And so that's where we got the idea. I will fast forward some of the story here, but my co-founder and I, Christine Kuglin, we started Innovations Academy, which is a public charter school in San Diego. We opened in 2008, but we took 2 years to found the school, starting in 2006, which is nowadays considered relatively fast. I remember we just couldn't wait for it to start. And we had this whole philosophy about learning by doing and really non-coercion and respecting where students and their families are at with something. So instead of coming in with our own preconceived notions about what someone should be able to do or how much they should be able to accomplish in a given school year, really looking at each independent learner. Being a school principal, because myself and my co-founder shared that responsibility, was a lot of work. I always say I would not wish school principalship on my worst enemy. And in fact, one of my best friends, Christine Kuglin, that co-founder, is still the director of that charter school. And I am on the board and will probably be on the board forever. But it's been one of the most amazing things that I've done, and also the most challenging. And we went through all the sort of startup up and downs that you can think of in terms of getting funding, losing funding, hiring staff, firing staff. We were responsible for actual children. We opened our doors to something like 160 students our first year. The school supports about 400 students now. So you feel really responsible when you have, young people in front of you, and you're promising to do a good job and better than what other schools are going to be doing in the area. But it was a really, really amazing time and really grounded me in a lot of educational philosophy, which is actually directly linked to what I'm doing now with 1517. So after starting the school, I ended up moving up to the Bay Area. I had a boyfriend in the area, and we were doing that flying back and forth thing. The school was in San Diego, and it was time to figure out who would go where. And there was sort of a great migration of friends from SoCal to NorCal. And I said, okay, I'll go north. I didn't have a job. I didn't know what I would do. I remember searching on Craigslist for places that I could live that, I could sort of eke out some of my savings, but not spend a ton. And I remember at the time thinking that $800 for the room I had was crazy expensive, even though it was the cheapest thing I could find. But nowadays I look at that and I'm like, wow, I really had a sweet deal in Mountain View. That was pretty good. But I came to the Bay with no plan. I don't know how to code. I don't have like direct access in science and tech. So I really didn't know what I would be doing here. So it's sometimes I look back on when I came here 11 years ago and think, wow, I could never imagine the position that I'm in now. But through a matter of events, I got a call from this woman, Lindy Fishburne, who worked at the Thiel Foundation. And her words to me were, hey, the foundation has lost their mind. They're starting this new program, the Thiel Fellowship, to award young people who are 19 and under $100,000 over 2 years to work on a science or tech project. They need someone to come run the program. I think you'd be really perfect for this. And I was like, wow, how fortuitous. Like, this is perfect for me. Like, there's a lot of my sort of homeschooling philosophy and non-coercive sort of pedagogy that would fit right into this program. So I immediately jumped on board. I did some interviews over there, and myself and my colleagues started building the Thiel Fellowship. And we had such an amazing time working with those young people and learning so much and creating the program with them, and seeing after 5 years the successes that people had, like Vitalik Buterin, Dylan Field of Figma, Laura Deming of the Longevity Fund, Ritesh Agarwal of Oyo Rooms, that we said, hey, we think we could scale what we're doing here at the foundation by starting a venture fund 1517 and take our work to the next level. So myself and Michael Gibson from the foundation, we started 1517 6 years ago to really further that mission of being able to show that one path is not for all. And it's been really extraordinary. I love working on the venture side. We make very early stage investments, sometimes just, mentoring people and working with them over time, sometimes a 50K check, sometimes a grant check. We actually have a 1K grant program we run. And then we write pre-seed checks as well. And that thesis is still true for us. We work predominantly with people who do not have a college degree. I'd say 85 to 90% of our founders fit that thesis. And what we're thinking about, more recently is we've gone from being a fund where you have a single fund to a firm where you have multiple investment vehicles, to really thinking about what does it mean for 1517 to be an institution. And, identity is something that is really interesting to me. And I don't think of ourselves as necessarily, like, we are investors and we do venture work, but it's not who we are. It's the mechanism for how we do the work we do. And so what we've come to with where we want to go as an institution is that we're an anti-establishment educational institution that happens to do its work by funding people. And so that's what we're kind of looking to set a foundation for, actually coming up in 2022 and beyond. So that's probably the short, long version of the background. But I thought I would start all the way back at that sort of inkling of, maybe there's something different out there, and it doesn't have to just look like going to 4 years of school.
Yeah, that's an awesome story, and I definitely appreciate the short, long version. Maybe next time we could do the long version.
Oh man,
what other stories come out in that one? But yeah, it's great, and it's interesting the common threads throughout. Obviously, couple directions I want to sort of take this, but first I want to start something you said kind of early on in the story: the difference when you were tutoring between homeschool students and kids who are in public and private school.
Yeah.
Homeschooling, I know there's a few companies that are sort of working on making this, better or more easier for parents to handle, I guess, through technology.
Yeah.
Like I had the founder of Primer on as one of my first episodes. They're doing some work there. But it seems to me that homeschooling, especially with increased costs in private education, COVID and the fact that a lot of parents sort of got a first taste of what it's like to do homeschooling in some
Sure.
fashion by force. It
Yep.
seems like a trend that should only continue to sort of increase in how many people are doing it. And
Yep.
for me personally, it's just very interesting. I've heard a lot of these stories and seen a lot of success stories from individuals who were homeschooled. So I'm curious if you could sort of like dig into what you think was at the root of the fact that like these homeschooled kids just seem so much more enthusiastic about learning, and did that translate to just generally better life for these kids, do you think? Or
Yeah.
what's your sort of assessment of homeschooling versus more traditional?
One thing that I found really interesting with the homeschooling families I work with was that there were a lot that were so flexible in how they thought about things. So there were families I would have where there would be 5 kids in the family, and maybe 3 kids in the family were homeschooled. And then maybe 2 at some point had said, "Hey, I really want to go to school." And then the parents had found either the private or public school that those kids wanted to go to. And I really admired those families a lot because what they were doing was thinking. They were making a conscious decision for each family member, and that child being considered in that and respected for what their needs were and what their choices and wants and desires were as well. And so with a lot of families, even for families who are, you might say, oh, like this kid goes to school or whatever, but if there's that conscious discussion going on at home of, hey, is this the best fit, is this a great place for you to be, I consider those families in almost that homeschooling bucket as well, because they're not just saying, oh, yeah, you go to the school that's down the street, or, hey, our family for generations has gone to the same private school, so that's where you're going to go, sort of thing. And so one of the things that I think is an undercurrent in a lot of homeschooling, and not all homeschooling, but is this idea of that the child is respected as a human being who maybe can't make full decisions on their own necessarily. Maybe they need some guidance and support, but that the parent is really more like a facilitator, than a authoritarian who says, no, you have to do X, you have to do Y. And I've seen that a lot in these families that, I would just say are like conscious educators, where they're making those decisions together as a family for, is homeschooling the right thing? Is private school the right thing? Is public school the right thing for each independent child? And the other thing that I see with homeschoolers in particular is that you get a lot of things where each person in the family is considered a learner. So you might have one child who really goes down a deep rabbit hole of history, let's say, and then that person becomes sort of, the one in the family who people go to talk about that subject. Or in these homeschooling co-ops that I was part of, sometimes those children would become like the authority figures on something, on a particular topic. And so there was just this idea that it didn't have to do with your age or particular standing. It was like that you could sort of prove just on your own, like what you knew, which is kind of interesting. I've actually, something that's sort of like two brain cells are coming together right now for me about, we say the same thing with our founders of like, we're not looking for a signal. We're not looking for that you went to Harvard, or that you went to a particular private school, or that YC has knighted you or whatever. What we're looking for is that, you're just showing us like sort of the raw horsepower of what you know about something. And I felt like this was also true for the young people that I worked with when I was tutoring. And I think that agency is really important. And being someone who is, excuse me, agency young, I do think that it leads to a potentially more productive adulthood.
Right. So that's interesting. You drew the parallel from like these homeschooled kids to the founders that you're working with now. And I was curious how you thought initially when the Thiel Foundation reached out to you about running this fellowship program, how you thought that experience might translate, or how they even identified that experience would
Yeah.
translate, and then how it did in
Yep.
practice.
Yeah.
And then maybe from there we can go a little bit deeper onto sort of what you did there, and
Sure.
trying to parse out sort of the how you were able to identify these amazing individuals, some of whom you named earlier.
Sure. No, absolutely. I think for me, it was very apparent when the foundation reached out that the homeschooling philosophy and non-coercive pedagogy was going to be a perfect fit for what they were going to do. And I think, people over there knew as well. I worked with Jim O'Neill, who was on the board of the foundation, and he homeschooled his children mostly for their early years in elementary school and maybe some middle school as well. And so there was definitely an alignment on that. And then it did filter into the program as well. We didn't say it like this when we were at the foundation, but we've just been sort of coming to these particular inklings lately with 1517, and they do play all the way back into the foundation, which is that we don't believe in playbooks. We really believe that each person is an individual and they're going to have different needs. And so we set up structures with what we do, and we both did this at the foundation, and we do it with 1517 as well, where there are structures to support people, but it's I don't know quite how to say it. It's like, for example, with Thiel Fellows, they would have reviews with the foundation and with a mentor, and often with other Thiel Fellows in the room as well. But there wasn't anything prescriptive. It wasn't like, oh, your fellowship should look like this, or hey, you're a seed stage company, so you should definitely raise X amount of money. I see a lot of playbook stuff coming out of accelerators, and I don't think it serves founders very well. I think that it's efficient, but efficiency isn't always effective. And it's something that we think about a lot in terms of each Thiel Fellow we worked with. It was like just an older young person's homeschooling program, where each of them was getting different support that they needed, but giving them all the support in the same way wasn't going to make sense. It's like when we had, a negotiation workshop, we wouldn't insist that every single Thiel Fellow come. We would say, hey, if this is a resource that is useful to you, then come and enjoy this. Like I always described it like a buffet table of, we're going to put lots and lots of stuff on the buffet table, but I'm not going to force feed you to eat. And it was hard because the teacher in me, I feel this FOMO about learning of like, oh, I can't believe this one person didn't come to this workshop, because I know that they could like extract a lot of good information from this, but they're not here. They prioritize something else. And what we learned was that people want information when the house is just barely on fire. So I remember talking to certain Thiel Fellows and being like, wait, why on earth wouldn't you come to the negotiation workshop? You're negotiating all the time, like in your life, in what you want to build. It's just like a great human skill to have. And they'd be like, well, I just didn't feel like I really needed it right now. So that relevancy piece wasn't there for them. And so we'd present a lot of different material so that when something was relevant, we had it right there sort of on tap. And I feel like that's true also for 1517. We're not going to say to every pre-seed founder, hey, here's what being a pre-seed founder looks like exactly. Because, in some cases we have a B2B SaaS company, in some cases we have a biotech company, and it would just be ridiculous to literally hand them, essentially a worksheet and say, all of you are the same. So that was something that was very much baked into the Thiel Foundation. And I think there's a piece of criticism that often gets tossed around that, there was no program or no structure. And that was just absolutely not true. It's just that we didn't make it look like force feeding things to children, because we didn't treat them like children. We treated them like capable human beings.
Yeah. And I mean, at a certain point, people can critique a lack of system or a lack of structure, but the proof is kind of in the pudding on that one. A lot of just really an amazing group of individuals. Like you compare it to Y Combinator, and I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I think it's like basically several hundred companies that YC has funded over the last decade and a half or so, versus I think at the Thiel Fellowship, you guys were taking like 20 or 25 people a year.
We were taking 20 people under 20 years old. So they had to be 19 or under. And within that first batch of Thiel Fellows, I think the stat is probably even better, but on my last count, which is probably a couple of years ago, even 1 out of 20 Thiel Fellows created an opportunity that was worth over $1 billion. So that is an absolutely mind-blowing statistic. I know there was a Thiel Fellows company that went public recently from a later batch, and it's like, man, this is pretty incredible to see, what young people can do. And I think part of like our whole message is just that, we always said at the foundation, some ideas just can't wait. And that's what it's about. It's not just about the cost of college. It's about the opportunity cost. And it's also about the opportunity cost of other people infantilizing people when they're in some of their most prime working years.
Right. So I guess the next question I have is like I think let me know if this is sort of unfair, but I would just like roughly split what goes into making these successes as sort of on the one hand like identification of the individuals,
Yep.
and on the
Yep.
second hand development,
Yep.
or incubation, I guess you could call
Yep.
it, like something like
Yep.
that. um and we spoke a bit to the development piece, like pretty
Yeah.
unstructured buffet style, take what you want, whatever's helpful, not going to force feed you. Makes sense, and it's like generally what I've heard from the few Thiel fellows that I've had on the show,
Yep.
or talked to otherwise. And so I think there's definitely something to be said for that like flexible, somewhat autonomous,
Yep.
high freedom, high encouragement, pursue your passion, homeschooling type of approach. And if there's anything else on that side, would love to hear about it. But
Sure.
I guess I'll start there. Is there anything else key on sort of the development side before we move over to the identification piece?
One thing that I think might fit on the development side is this idea of belief. One thing that we found to be very powerful over time is just being granted permission. And we saw this as a huge thing, especially at our finalist rounds, where we would have these people come in and they'd say, wow, thank you for inviting me to this. Like you see me, you see what I'm doing. And it was interesting within the foundation program as well, because what we had were a lot of people who, when they would get the Thiel Fellowship, they would have like this early 20s life crisis where they were like, wow, holy mackerel. Like, I just got this amazing grant and this huge opportunity. And now I think the thing I applied with isn't even like the thing I fully want to work on, because now I have the opportunity, and like having the opportunity is different than dreaming about it. And I think there's something in that development piece about having a supportive community that like points and says like, yeah, we believe that you have the potential to do something greater than than even yourself possible to do. And we see this all the time, especially with 15, 17 now. People come back to us 6 or 7 years later, hey, you gave me a grant when I was in high school, you believed in me first, and that helped me to figure out that I did want to go to grad school later, in this particular topic. And this happened the other day. I had a coffee with a young man who came to one of our events, and he said, that event really opened my eyes to technology and progress. And, now I'm at Cal getting my PhD in AI and ML, and I just can't thank you enough. And I was like, I didn't even know we did that. Like, I had no idea that we had made any difference in this person's life. And it was only because they tweeted out at me over Twitter, like, hey, yeah, I love that event I came to when I was 14 years old, and I'd love to catch up and tell you where I'm at now. And I was blown away.
Yeah, I think another way to say it, I mean, the way that you said it is great. Like the belief, I think is definitely one word for it. Another way that I think about it, if you didn't say explicitly, is just sort of like recognition.
Totally.
I
Yeah.
think a lot
Yeah.
of people, I think that's like a pretty, both having people believe in you and having some recognition from others, they're sort of synonymous, but
Yep.
maybe a little bit, that they're both helpful in their own ways, and definitely come one in the same.
Totally.
But I think that a lot of people are sort of growing up, like, you ask kids what they want to be when they grow up, and they want to be like astronauts and professional athletes and all the rest, right? Famous
Yeah.
actors, whatever it might be. And then you sort of get far enough through the education system and you get ranked according, along with your peers, and you're not the smartest one in your class. And like you sort of stop believing in yourself, probably. Uh,
Absolutely.
and especially like, you join the workforce, there's just more and more placing you in competition and saying that you're not the best at this sort of generic game where like
Yeah.
if you excel in one particular thing, you're not
Mhm.
going to be the best at like the average of all of them or whatever.
Right.
um and so getting recognized by like, by Thiel, or his foundation and the fellowship at 20, when I think a lot of people sort of hang on to that high hope and belief in themselves through high school, through college. Not everyone, but like certainly it hasn't been beaten out of everyone yet. And so to be recognized at that stage of your life, I think something like that, especially when you're getting funded like $100,000, it can give you like another 10 or 20 years of runway to believe in yourself potentially. And
Yeah.
it's great that you brought that up, because I think that must have been a pretty powerful factor for a lot of people.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right on. I even wrote down the word recognition because I think it's a great word to use.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. That's just sort of I tried to hold the mirror to what you said
Yeah,
and
no, that
add
was,
to it a little bit, but I think
no, I love,
it's an important thing that I definitely wouldn't have thought of
yeah,
had you not
yeah,
mentioned it. So jumping to the other side, which I
yeah,
think may or may not be as or more important,
yep,
is the identification, because just the sheer numbers of it, like you put together the best program in the world, even um, you put 20 people in who are sort of average or even 75th percentile or even like 90th percentile capability, even 99th probably, you're not going to get any billion-dollar companies out of that.
right,
You have to plug in super exceptional people in terms of what they're capable of and what the max of their potential is to get these absurd outcomes that the Thiel Fellowships realized. So
yep,
I'm curious, like there's a few different pieces of this funnel, and like I took a few notes beforehand, but I think it's sort of recruiting because you need to like solicit the applications in the first
yep,
place,
yep,
then the design of the applications themselves, the evaluation of those applications that are submitted, and then sort of like the final interviewing and decision
yep,
making process. So if you could walk through that, or if there's
yep,
different stages,
no,
would love to
absolutely.
hear how that worked.
Absolutely. And yeah, you're right. Identification is really important. And outreach is really, really important. And yeah, there's like many thoughts spinning through my head, but I'm going to attempt to tell a linear thing about sort of start to finish, and I'll add some commentary as we go. But one of the important parts was we really had to put out, like, we called it a bat signal for the Thiel Fellowship, because this idea in 2010 of, hey, there might be some young people out there that don't want to be sitting in a classroom, who are 19 and under, and might want to join this wacky program and get a grant, work on something for 2 years. It was completely radical. It was sacrilegious to talk about it. And so we had to go out on foot on campuses and meet people where they were at. And that was a big part of our outreach, and still remains a big part of our outreach, is we really, really believe that there is amazing talent out there, but you have to go to places and you have to turn over stones, because the type of person, like someone like a Vitalik type, he's probably not like watching mains, and consider again that this is like 10 years ago, like, I wouldn't have considered social media necessarily like a news outlet like it is now. But 10 years ago, I wouldn't have thought like, oh yeah, Vitalik's going to hear something about us, on a program on TV, and then he's going to apply. It's like, that's not how this is going to work. We're going to have to go out and scout people. And so we spent a lot of time on different campuses. We took lots of different, especially the first year, we just went to lots of campuses and talked to people about the program. Peter himself did some of that outreach as well, which is really great, especially that first year. After that first year, we also got a lot of sort of referrals of like, hey, like if you were looking for someone like you, where would you go look? Where would you turn over stones? And so they'd give us recommendations to their high schools or other programs they were part of. First Robotics was mentioned a lot. So a lot of it was just boots on the ground, like getting out there and working with people. Once people were inside of the applicant pool, we would always do a first screening, and it doesn't work like this anymore. So I'll just speak to how it used to work. Excuse me. We would get applicants in, they would apply. We would do a first skim, always by humans, to look at applications, and any application that you could tell the person had put some amount of effort into and wasn't just like, oh, I'm throwing my hat in the ring for some free money. We would go on to a mentor stage, where we had a pool of mentors who would review all those applications and write specific feedback on, hey, here's what I think you should do to push this forward. We would actually give that feedback to these applicants. And what was super interesting about that was later on, we asked this question about, what does the next 10 years look like? What does the next 2 years look like? And what do the next 2 months look like? And because the application cycle was 4 months long, we could go back to people and ask them about sort of, hey, how'd those 2 months go? And it wasn't a gotcha like, oh, did you do the thing you said you do? It's more like, what did you learn during this time? Because, with all good intent, you can set what you think is going to be a goal and then find out it's much harder to achieve. And so it was very interesting to see who was kind of good at goal and level setting, who would take some of the mentor feedback we would give and use it. That was sort of coachability we were looking for. And then eventually we would do a phone screen for around, I think the top like 80 people or so. And what we're trying to get to was a top 40 to bring out to our finalist round. And I'm trying to think if there's anything in particular. I mean, I think there's something about at that screening, it was often sort of just a phone interview that we were doing. And a lot of what we were looking for is really like enthusiasm of, hey, this person's like working on this idea. They're very excited about the space. We could see them using this time and this money effectively. And then we flew people out to our finalist round, which was top 40. And those finalist events were very interesting. I remember I was always sort of concerned about, oh gosh, like, I don't want this to be science fair. I don't want this to be hyper competitive. I want this to be the place where young people come and say like, wow, like I'm loving who I'm meeting here kind of thing. And we were very lucky in that very first finalist round, we had this one young man who had shown up to the hotel pretty early, and he decided like all on his own, he was going to make himself welcome wagon. And so he sat in the lobby and would greet every young person who he saw walk into the lobby and be like, hey, his name's Brahm. He'd be like, hey, I'm Brahm. Nice to meet you. We should all grab dinner tonight and we should do this and do that. And I was like, oh my God, this guy's amazing. Like he's totally diffusing the science fair, who's going to win the competition energy that could naturally come up. And so I still know Brahm. And I'm thankful to him to this day for what he did, because it was amazing to get these young people together, because what they would say at the event was, wow, I've never met other young people like me. And I remember digging into that a bit because I was confused. I was like, okay, but aren't you meeting other young people on your campus, who are kind of like you, like smart, interesting people? And they were like, no, you don't understand. It's not about that. Like there's plenty of smart people on campus, but there aren't people who are doing something outside of school just because. Like there aren't people geeking out about something because they just love it. It's because it's going to get them a grade or be used for their resume or to get them that, primo internship or whatever. And people just look at you if you have six heads, if you say you're like trying to start a project or a startup. And I thought that was super, super, super interesting. And actually it was that feedback that made us go and say, we bet this sort of ethos extends down the applicant pool. So we started doing something called our Thiel summits, where we would invite a couple hundred young people to really meet other people like them. And those were incredibly impactful events. But right now we're talking about identification, so I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But at that finalist round, it was interesting, especially that first year, because we didn't really know what we were looking for. I remember reading Tom Courier's application from the first batch of fellows. And I had read 150 applications. I felt like my eyeballs were bleeding out of my face, just because I had read so many things. And I hadn't quite hit on anybody yet that I was like, this is the type of person we're looking for. But there was something in his application that was really infectious. We had people send in written and videos. And he like told these stories about when he was in elementary school and he decided he tried to like build a house out of bamboo in his backyard. And he was always the kid who was like trying to sell things in the classroom when the teacher wasn't looking and stuff like that. And he was working on a solar technology, mostly in robotics. And he was just really interesting. And I remember when I read his application, I was like, oh my God, this is the type of person we've been looking for. It took me 150 application reads to find this type of person. But I think there were like things that were standing out that made him seem like a couple standard deviations above what the rest of the applicant pool was looking like. And so then we kind of were using certain applications as like a baseline of like, okay, these seem like the types of people we're interested in. Or like Laura Deming had this deep, deep, insatiable passion for longevity, and not just passion for it, but she had been like interning in people's labs since the time she was a young teenager. And she was like really invested in the space. And it was another one of these examples of like, okay, this is one of those like couple standard deviations out people. It actually wasn't until a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago, that our team on the 15-17 side, we said, we think we now, after 11 years, have enough data to like really come up with what we would call some of these qualities. And it's taken us a long time to figure it out because it's hard to articulate it. I always tell people, like, the people we work with are very, very curious people. But when you say that, everyone thinks of the curious person they know. They don't think of two standard deviations out on curious. And so it's like, I have cousins who are 20 years younger than me, and they're great and they're smart and they're very curious, but they're not what we're talking about. Like there's something like literally categorically different. So one of these traits, I'll just name off one for now, that we look for, something we call hyperfluency. And it's this ability to talk backwards and forwards about a space ad nauseum and be able to scaffold that communication up and down, where you can talk to an expert in your space, but you can also talk to your grandma about it. And the reason this is super important to us is because if you're building a team and other people, you need to be able to talk at different levels for things and very articulately. And the skill set of people who can do both of those things is pretty small. There's a lot of people who can talk super high level, and there's a lot of people who can, use like, I don't know, regular nomenclature, but the people who are super savvy in an area and, can talk to you about it like it was written out of a children's book is very, very thin. So that's one of those traits. But that identification piece that you're mentioning is huge. And it's something that we tweaked over time. I remember in the first year of the Thiel Fellowship, we were very much sort of emulating college a little bit too much. We used to ask for SATs and SAT2s. And I think it was after the second group of Thiel Fellows, we let go of that section. And started looking more at like, what is this person doing? Because we found that even people who were science fair winners and people who had great SATs, when you put them out in the wild and said, hey, you can do whatever you want for 2 years, they were like, cool, but how do I get my A? And we're like, you don't get an A. There's no classroom here. Like, you're now in a totally different environment. They did not do as well as the people who really understood, oh, I'm driving my own destiny now, and I have the opportunity to make and build something. Yeah, what am I going to do with that time?
Yeah, that's an awesome overview, and especially at the like I like the beginning. You talked about like putting out the bat signal, boots on the ground. I thought it was particularly interesting to ask the people where they would find others like themselves as
Yep.
sort of a way
Yep.
to track them down. And then, skimming from however many applications came in to 80 phone calls and ultimately 40 in person for the final round. It's impressive for me to hear that you guys, well, how many applications did you start off with, I guess,
The first year
approximately?
was the first year was 400 applicants.
Yeah, so skimming from 400 to 80,
Yep.
that's like 80%
Yep.
cut without even talking to the people. And I think that's just like pretty impressive. I often wonder if you have to talk to people to sort of make that evaluation, but it sounds like at a high level, no. You never know who was maybe left in the 80%
Absolutely.
bucket that didn't get the call, but still it seems like that was sufficient to cut the first 80% and then another 80 to 40 with the phone call makes sense. And it's not, 50% cut off a phone call seems very reasonable.
Yep.
And then the 40 in person. So it's an
Yep.
interesting filtering for sure. And then towards the end, the fact that you guys didn't really know what exactly you were looking for, maybe, and were able to figure it out just by pattern matching the types of people who just evidently stood out.
Yep.
You guys weren't looking to like match to some criteria. You just sort of
It
recognized.
was also like, we have to see what's in this pool of people. We were very open to maybe nobody in this pool of people is where we should be going. And like, if we need to like delay the onset of the program, we would do that. And so we were very open about like, we'll see what happens. But I do remember that first finalist round, I'll never forget, because we were getting to meet these people in the flesh. And I always say that people are 3D and materials are 2D. So like reading what someone wrote on an application versus meeting them in person was like transformational for everybody. It was huge. And I've, I've always been very curious about the experiment of like, yes, we always picked who we thought would thrive most in the program as the sort of top 20. But there's like a mischievous part of me that always wonders if we had just done a random assortment of, those 40 and said, okay, we're going to, throw a die and pick the 20 based off that I think I think we could have had some very interesting results from that experiment.
Yeah, I mean that's at that point that's already the top 10%, and at that point I think you're splitting hairs probably, so makes sense.
Yep.
So I'm going to ask you another question that I'm not sure whether or not you'll want to answer, so I'll give you a backup in case you don't. But you talked about the term hyperfluency, which I thought was super interesting. I've never heard that term before. I don't know if you invented
Yeah,
it,
we made
but
it. We made it up. Yep.
okay, yeah, awesome term and word, and what it describes. I think it's just, people who I've always found that the smartest people can describe the things that they're experts in extremely simply. And that's often what I ask people on the podcast who are experts in their given field to do.
Yeah. Yep.
And it's just super impressive when they can do that. And sometimes people can't. They just live in that like really, really deep in the weeds area
That's
and
right.
sort of can't come out for air. Not to say that they're not, I haven't like identified that term or anything. I never thought, oh, these people
Well,
maybe,
we have a term for those people.
what's that?
What we call that is the cloud of abstractions. They're people
Uh,
who are really smart and they sound really smart, but when you ask them a very pointed, like, hey, this question is an answerable question, they tend to answer in really big abstractions. And what we've seen with those folks is that it is often a way of trying to hide that not a whole lot is going on. It's like,
hmm,
okay, you sound really smart, but when I ask you, where does the rubber meet the road? And, like one of our favorites is we always ask people about their 10-year vision, but I always ask people, what are you doing on Friday? And when they can't answer for me, like, here's what I'm doing on Friday, something is wrong. Like, and it's not that something's wrong with them, but it's that something is not equating to this person is going to be a pattern match for the type of person who is going to maybe work well with us. So like maybe they'll be a successful entrepreneur, maybe other things will happen. Our job is to miss a lot of the time. But in our opinion, you have to be able to do both, like know what you're doing on Friday and have that 10-year vision.
yeah, it reminds me of the guy in the bar from the movie Good Will Hunting, who's
Yes.
quoting the textbook. And I
Yes.
think Good Will
Exactly.
Hunting would have got into the program, but maybe that guy
Totally.
not so much.
Yes, that's exactly right. You got it.
So the question I want to ask that you may or may not answer, and then the second question, which we'll get to either way, but you decide if you want to skip there. The one you might want to skip is I'd love to hear as many terms and descriptions of those terms as you have sort of labeled. And it
Sure.
sounds like you just got to doing this like a couple of weeks ago, which is,
Yeah.
I know it's like 10 years of learning maybe, but
Yes.
if you're willing to share it, would love to hear it. And then
Yeah.
second, would love to talk about 1517 and how you've translated a lot of what you learned at Thiel to what you're doing today.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I have these terms in front of me because I haven't like committed them to memory yet. Because it's like, oh yeah, we're still figuring this out. We're only 11 years old. We're figuring this out. Um, One of them is we look for people who have this characteristic that we call edge work. The idea is that it's people who are somewhat comfortable being uncomfortable. So there's an example of this where if you're riding a motorcycle into a tight turn, you have to lean pretty far over to go into it. If you don't lean over far enough, you skid. And if you lean too far, you also like fall. Like,
Hmm.
so it's this really interesting edge where you have to be over to a point that feels uncomfortable, but if you don't go there, you're gonna mess up. And like, on a motorcycle, if you mess up, sometimes you mess up big. So it's this idea of people who can kind of lean in to an edge on something and be uncomfortable, but ideally not to the point of destruction. So that's one that is important to us. We have one we call Friday Night Dyson Sphere. These are the people who love to geek out. Maybe in the past, these would have been the people who like hung out on LAN parties on a Friday night. These folks want to stay up over the weekend and are like eating, drinking, and sleeping like really big, ridiculous ideas. So we love those folks. I'll go over maybe just two more of them. One is what we call the Zen arrow. It's this idea of egoless ambition, where people have a target that they are going for, but it's about hitting the target, not about them being the arrow. I always say with 1517, we have a no asshole policy. And I think this kind of hits at it a lot. It's mission driven people who can kind of get out of their own way, but at the same time, again, be focused on this target. And then the last one we call acorn to oak, which is kind of the what are you doing on Friday question of like, okay, you've got this vision, you're going to become like this oak tree, or your company's going to become this big thing. But again, you have to start somewhere with this acorn. And that's that Friday question of like, well, what do you, I love gardening. So it's like, what are you planting on Friday to get to where you want to be as an oak? So those are just some of them. But it's been really fun for us to put these together, because I think for a long time it's been really difficult for us to articulate what we're looking for. And the only reason we even know what we're looking for is because of the many thousands of people that went through that application process in the Thiel Foundation, and then many more thousand that we have gone through with 1517, that has given us the insight into what these characteristics kind of look like. And without those training wheels, I feel like I would be flying blind. I mean, I remember in the first year of the Thiel Foundation, we were so nervous because it was like, we didn't know what was going to happen for these people. We didn't know what was going to happen with Peter's reputation. We didn't know what was going to happen with these young people's reputation. And so something good would happen and we would be like, hooray, something good happened today for somebody. And then the next day, something bad would happen for somebody. And we'd be like, oh no, something bad happened today. So it was this extreme emotional roller coaster. And I think if I had to ride that roller coaster while making investment decisions, it'd be very difficult. So we got 5 years of sort of riding a longer term emotional roller coaster, and we're able to see some of the outcomes so that we can get out of our own way, kind of that Zen arrow ourselves of being able to see like, okay, this is the target, and we're going to do the best we can, but we're also going to sort of release that a lot of this is luck and chance and other things that are going on. So yeah, that's a little bit about those areas. And then I know you wanted to talk more about 1517.
Yeah, that was great, and much more than I expected you to share. So
Oh,
appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to listening back because I think I expected that you would. The first one was hyperfluency. I thought that the list might contain like regular words, but it sounds like you invented a bunch and sort of
we
defined
invented
them. So
we
you're gonna
invented
have
a
to.
lot of terms. The reason I think it's been important for us to invent these terms is that when you speak a language, everyone is supposedly on the same page about what you're talking about. So this is when I would get frustrated sometimes and be like, yeah, we're looking for people, I'd say, our investor would ask us like, what are the traits that you look for? And I was like, listen, I can write all these traits out on paper, but like, it's not going to make you better at identifying somebody. You're going to think you know something when you don't. It's about actually working with people and starting to see these traits for yourself. And so when we would say things like, super curious people, everyone thinks that they've met someone who's super curious, and they probably have at some point or another. But like, we have gotten to meet really, really, really super curious people. That's that like 2 standard deviations out thing. And people just package what they know in your language. So that's why we like came up with our own terms. So then people can't put their own view on what we do. And at least we hope that it gives people the ability to listen a little, maybe more differently and nuanced to what we're saying than assuming that they know what these traits are.
Yeah, I think by making up the words, they basically have to understand the definition that you make that
Yep,
word represent. And with the
that's right.
definition, you get a lot more opportunity to sort of specify what you're talking about versus just a word, which can be really generally interpreted and misinterpreted in a lot of cases, I think.
Yeah. Yep.
So yeah, last thing, I know we're actually over on time, but I know you've got a couple of minutes left, fortunately, without the hard stop. So would love to talk about what you're doing today and the 1517 fund, how it's sort of taken these learnings from the Thiel Fellowship, which was not like a fund. It was just sort of a nonprofit, I guess, that was giving money away,
Yep.
expecting no returns. And I've always been super curious as to how could you scale the Thiel Fellowship to something that could make returns, not because like, returns are the end all be all, but It's hard to like have a nonprofit sustain for a very long
Oh,
period of time, and you can just scale it a lot more in a for-profit way, I would imagine. So curious to hear how you guys are seeking out to do that.
yeah, absolutely. So we are super excited with our third fund, which we're going to be launching in the new year, to really be, yeah, scaling 1517 out as this anti-establishment educational institution. And so this means, writing more checks into companies. This means writing more grants to people. We've been sort of tinkering on some new grant ideas, and other types of funding as well. And so, yeah, it's, I've been thinking about, we're coming up on our investor meeting in December, and I've been thinking about kind of putting out a theme for the new year. And I think our theme is going to be foundation. And it's really about laying this foundation of what it means for 1517 to be becoming an institution. And that's going to mean looking out for things that we're like positively inclined for, and what are the pitfalls of institutions. Because, there's systemic things that happen within that sort of context that I think we're going to have to be aware of. So I'm very curious to start digging into that and building that out more. We've been very fortuitous. One of our founders, Austin Russell, had an IPO, and that was in December of last year. And so he is one of the youngest self-made billionaires, and he's really helped to sort of push out our message of one path is not for all. And, so the question that is always on our minds is, how do we find more Austins? Kind of like that turning over stones question. And it's a very long game that we're playing, because with an investment, you don't get to find out, in year two, even like how things are going. You might have an inkling of how things are going, but we don't count our chickens before they hatch. And we've seen companies that looked really great on the surface later on crash and burn. And we've seen companies that didn't look so great on the surface, like really thrive. So it's really, again, about what we talked about before, about identification of people, as well as development within those groups. And we're super excited for this coming year, because we're going to start doing more content, more founder retreats, more events, since the world is opening back up. So I think maybe the word I'll leave off with is more. Like, we're just really excited to do more of what we do.
More sounds good. More of what you've been doing would be great, it sounds like. And appreciate you spending the time talking about some of the Thiel Fellowship stuff. I know that's a little bit in the past, but these things take a lot of years to sort of
Oh,
develop.
yeah.
And so we can do the reflection on 1517 maybe in the near future. But definitely excited about everything that you're doing, and really appreciate you coming on again, Danielle. Where can people go to keep up with everything you're working on, and check out 1517 Fund and all that?
Absolutely. I would recommend checking out 1517fund.com. I can also be emailed at Danielle at 1517fund.com. Always feel free to reach out. And my Twitter is dstrachman. So yeah, very happy to connect with people.